USS Sable and USS Wolverine. The sailors and aviators stationed on Lake Michigan during World War II were instructed to tell no one of their participation in a secret U.S. Navy program floating in the middle of the U.S.'s largest body of freshwater. Two aircraft carriers used for training and experimental tests, the USS Sable and the USS Wolverine, were hiding in plain sight. Both were converted Great Lakes paddle boats from the first days of the 1910s that required a strong wind to launch their aircraft due to their short decks, which were insufficient for a standard takeoff. They lacked anti-aircraft guns, high-caliber cannons, elevators, armored decks, hangar decks, and all the essentials that legendary U.S. carriers overseas had to fight the ferocious Japanese Navy and the German Kriegsmarine. Both ships were acquired by the Navy in 1942 and converted to training aircraft for pilots and landing signal officers, or LSOs. Because both transformed carriers could only reach a top speed of 18 knots, operational limits required at least 30 knots of WOD, or wind over the deck, to overcome the limitations of the short decks and conduct flying and landing sessions. If pilots could not reach the adequate height and speed quickly, they risked sinking, as there was not enough space or height for a standard takeoff. The USS Lexington, one of the carriers that would make history during the war, had a height of 32.4 feet, while the USS Wolverine stood at just 15.5 feet at the bottom of her keel. One of the young pilots who qualified on the Sable was none other than the US's future president, George H.W. Bush. Overall, both carriers trained more than 17,000 pilots and endured more than 100,000 landings. It's estimated that 150 planes and 12 pilots rest on the lake's bottom because of the dangerously short decks that led to unsuccessful takeoffs and landings. Compared to the failures, the success ratio remains an outstanding detail that proved how well-trained the American aviators were during wartime. Under stress by the precarious conditions, most pilots were able to take off and land successfully. These skills would demonstrate their Pacific capabilities, where time, order, and discipline in aerial combat would lead the U.S. to victory. The USS Sable and USS Wolverine were decommissioned in November 1945 and scrapped later. Although not widely known, the Navy also tested secret drone airplanes to combat Japan's kamikazes. More than 40 of the aircraft that were sunk during sessions have been recovered from the bottom of the lake. Secret Nazi-German weather station in Canada. It was not until 1977 that a secret Nazi weather station was uncovered at the northern tip of Canada's Labrador Peninsula. 38 years after its installation, it remained in excellent condition, almost completely intact, and in the very same place where German Kriegsmarine sailors set foot to install it and gather intel that could be of use against the Allies in the fight for the Atlantic. Weather Station Kurt was delivered to North America in 1943 by meteorologist Dr. Kurt Sommermeier aboard the German U-boat U-537. Germany was the underdog in the Atlantic. The small but significant U-boat fleet was no rival against the numerically superior Royal Navy and U.S. aircraft carriers that patrolled the oceans. To shift the balance, the Third Reich dispatched U-boat 537 and its crew with a classified mission. The objective, the installation of a weather station in the Arctic. If installed correctly, the Kriegsmarine could use the meteorological data to develop plans under specific climates to disguise U-boats, warships, or aircraft from enemies. To do so, scientists from the Siemens Company developed an automatic weather station capable of broadcasting data every 3 hours over a 2-minute transmission at 3940 kHz. It was called Wetterfunkgerät-Land, or WFL. Only 26 of them were made. Most were placed in Greenland, where the U.S. also had their own systems, while the others remained installed across the Barents Sea. The WFL that U-boat 537 carried was equipped with 2 masts and an anemometer that registered wind speeds and direction. An innovative telemetry device allowed the station to automatically send the data it gathered. After an arduous journey where the U-boat was damaged by an iceberg, the crew, under Captain Peter Schreve's command, arrived in Martin Bay, Labrador, in October 1943. After scouting the zone to see if it was inhabited, the meteorologists on board, Dr. Sommermeier and Hildebrandt, began installing the 100-kilogram station. While the rest of the crew conducted repairs, patrols concluded that the area was not populated by the native Canadians, the Inuits. To conceal the station, its equipment was labeled Canadian Meteor Service, and empty American cigarette packs were left behind to further disguise the small facility as entirely Canadian. It remained hidden until 1977, when a geomorphologist at Martin Bay spotted it, but thought it was a Canadian installation because of the fake labels used by the Germans. Thanks to a retired Siemens engineer who went through Sommermeier's papers in 1981, the Canadian government learned the real story behind the installation. Since then, Weather Station Kurt has been dismantled and taken to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, where it can be appreciated on display. It remains the only confirmed German military operation to land in North America, but sources say that the Reich went further in the continent. The German bunkers of Antarctica. It is not strange for historians to discover conspiracy theories, supernatural studies, or relations to the occult when studying the history of Hitler's Third Reich. Himmler himself, the SS leader, was a firm believer of the occult and the power that Nordic runes and other ancient items could give to those who find them. During the brief existence of the Reich, hundreds of German military and scientific expeditions were financed by the state to uncover hidden artifacts or ancient cities scattered through the world that could give Germany an edge for the war against the Allies. One such expedition took place in the frozen wastelands of Antarctica. It is said that the Germans found underground caves and rivers that they turned into sophisticated facilities, eventually becoming an underground city with state-of-the-art technology. Geologist and oceanographer Colin Summerhays partnered with historian Peter Beeching to examine the evidence about Antarctica and the Nazis. In a paper published by both authors, they established that the Germans indeed carried out a whaling expedition to Antarctica in 1938, but not on a grand scale to build a city. Nonetheless, little is known about such an expedition. Believers of dark conspiracies argued that there is indeed a secret base in Antarctica where Hitler spent his last days after he escaped to Argentina with other high-ranking officers. This theory's support is based on an alleged treaty Hitler signed with other superpowers prohibiting Antarctica's bombardment. But the secret would remain buried beneath the snow in Antarctica, one of the least explored corners of the world for the harsh conditions of its weather. Imperial Japanese Base in Alaska. In 1942, Japanese forces seized Kiska Island in the Aleutian Islands, then a part of the U.S. territory of Alaska, but it took nearly a year for the U.S. Navy to respond with an invasion force after a prolonged bombing campaign and blockade. Japan launched the offensive to protect the northern flank of the Japanese Empire and its territories. When the invasion took place, only 12 U.S. Navy sailors were present on the island. 2 men were lost, 1 went MIA, and the rest were captured. Until July 1943, the Japanese occupation was partially ignored by the U.S. The war's focus was centered around the Solomon Islands campaign in the Pacific. Eventually, U.S. bombardments began hitting the Japanese fortifications. This was followed by a naval blockade of U.S. warships that destroyed Japanese carriers and submarines that tried to supply the garrison trapped on the island. On July 29th, Admiral Kitmura Masatomi, under cover of a heavy fog, evaded the American blockade with a small fleet and rescued the 5,000 men stationed on the island. Not knowing about the evacuation, the Allied soldiers conducted an amphibious assault that led to 300 friendly fire casualties. After landing on August 15th, the U.S. patrols were shocked to discover that the Japanese had built an entire submarine pen and a resupply base on the island. In less than 11 months, under freezing temperatures, the highly disciplined Japanese soldiers built hundreds of roads, buildings, and defensive fortifications that were completely abandoned and covered in graffiti when the Americans found them. With the Japanese retreat, Operation Land Crab put an end to the Japanese ambition of creating an operating base close to the mainland U.S. Secret Japanese submarine bases in Mexico. Some rumors suggest Japan maintained 2 submarine bases on Mexico's Pacific coast during World War II. One of them was called La Palma and was located in the state of Chiapas, while the other lay on the Baja Peninsula at Magdalena Bay, 600 miles from the city of San Diego, California. Spies reportedly uncovered the hidden depots hewed out of the jungle's side following tips from local Yaqui Indians of the region. Newspaper reports in 1941 also suggest the Chiapas government discovered a Nazi radio station on an airfield in the mountains. Both the German and Japanese navies are thought to have approached Mexico in 1912 to purchase Pacific harbors in the area. A controversial theory suggests the secret Mexican bases were intended to be a staging area for an attack on the Panama Canal. It may be possible, as in the 1930s, a substantial percentage of the Mexican elite was very fond of Hitler's Third Reich. Some German companies had established themselves in Mexico as far back as the 1870s, after the Second Mexican Empire's collapse. In his book, Land Where Time Stands Still, author Max Miller wrote that he saw Japanese submarines during a trip he took in 1941 to Puerto San Carlos in La Paz, Baja California. He wrote, quote, "Then they point to Magdalena Bay as an example. And the time immediately prior to Pearl Harbor, when Japanese submarines did lie in wait there, submerged by day, awaiting the all-out signal. They had not been there long apparently, but they were there in hiding undetected until spotted one night by some stray Mexicans on that bleak coast. And the Mexicans told us in La Paz, and 2 other La Paz Americans and I immediately informed the Navy as best we could.